It should happen now. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, let's start with the introduction. Hello and welcome everyone, and let's welcome Professor Rajiv Sinha and his team for accepting our invitation and spending their Friday night with us. So for the introduction part, Rajiv Sinha is a professor of Earth Science at Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, with a master's degree in applied geology from University of Roorkee in 1987 and a PhD in sedimentology from University of Cambridge in 1992. Professor Sinha has worked on various aspects of river hydrology and groundwater system during his career. Apart from his early work on proposing a new source area classification for Gangetic River system, one of his most significant contribution has been characterization of geomorphic diversity across Gangetic Plain as a function of the balance between stream power and sediment flux, thus demonstrating the variability in landscape evolution due to the coupling of climate and tectonic factors. He has also worked on several other projects in the Ganga basin related to hydrological and sediment transport modeling, environmental flows, and flood risk assessment. Professor Sinha has published more than 200 papers with over 7,000 citations. He had set up a critical zone observatory in the agricultural dominated Ganga basin in 2014 and has been involved in several studies related hydrometeorology, remote sensing based measurements, including thermal imaging from drones and groundwater restoration. He is a recipient of Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship 2000, National Mineral Award 2002, and SS Mir Award 2006. He is a Fellow of National Academy of Science, Allahabad, and Indian Academy of Science, Bangalore.
Thank you, Tarun. So shall I start?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Try the sharing the screen first. So I guess you can share. I can see my screen.
Yes.
Yes, we can.
It's not.
Yeah,
in
I'll
the
go to the
present- It's not in the
mode.
presentation mode.
Yeah, I'm going there now.
Okay.
Now it should be okay.
Perfect.
All right. So thanks very much, Tarun, for introducing me, and Praveen for inviting me for this talk. I've been looking forward to meet and interact with all of you. It's a very active group, one of the best in the world on CZO science, I guess. So Praveen and I have been in touch for a fairly long time, but we finally met only this year in Lucknow. And so we had a chat about this CZO, which we set up, a couple of years back. And the idea of this talk is to give you a sort of, rather broad brush on what are the different things which we are trying to do, particularly related to hydrometeorology and soil moisture estimation. This is a CZO, which you can see in the background itself. It's a very highly agricultural landscape, which it is sitting there, and therefore, there are not much of industrial intervention or anthropogenic disturbance, except for those which are related to agriculture. So we'll look at that as well. But before I start, let me acknowledge the various funding agencies and individuals who have been involved in this project for the last many years. It was set up initially by the Ministry of Earth Sciences, with a moderate funding from them. Most of the instrumentation which are there, they actually supported that. We then got again a very good funding from the STC NERC UK, which was led by Dr. Harjinder Singh at the University of Leicester UK, which supported a lot of the thermal infrared work. We were then supported by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Germany. And again, that work, we are doing jointly with Professor Bodo Buchhagen at University of Potsdam. And also, of course, we currently have a moderate funding from ESA, which is called a Restore IT project, which is again, coordinated by Harjinder Singh and Darren Gent at University of Leicester. And again, we have a small funding coming up now from the Space Technology Cell, ISRO. There have been several students who've been working in this, CZO for the last couple of years. All three are here. Manodev Singh, who is now at Potsdam as a Humboldt Fellow, and Saroj Kumar Dash, who is about to finish his PhD, and Sambit Behera, who has, just completed his master's. So the work which I'm going to show is primarily based on the work which we did under the initial stages of the CZO funded by Ministry of Earth Sciences, and then a lot of work which has been done recently by Saroj and also by Sambit. So there are a lot of combination of things which you will see. So I decided to use this broad brush, because I wanted to give you a feel of what exactly are the aspects which we are trying to do. We'll give you an overview of the CZO network which we have and how are we integrating the data set. We'll talk about the spatial-temporal variability of the hydrometeorological data sets. And then there'll be a lot of focus on the soil moisture estimation from the remote sensing data as well as from the satellite-based measurements. Both satellite-based measurements as well as the UAV-based measurements as well. We also have a pretty nice closed dense network of ground measurements of the soil moisture, which I will show you the data from. And then we'll talk about the future directions, which we are hoping to follow up as a part of this project. So I understand it's going to be a sort of a rather mix up, but each of these topics probably deserve a separate talk. But yeah, we can go into details at any given time, now or later. So this slide is not needed for this kind of an audience here, but I just wanted to flag the major characteristics of this CZO. This is covering a small watershed in a tributary of the main Ganga River, which is here, and that's the tributary. And we have a watershed somewhere here, which is about 10 to 12 kilometers from our campus, IIT campus. The entire CZO, we have called this as a heterogeneous ecosystem of an agro-rural terrain, HEART CZO, which covers an area of about 21.5 square kilometer. It's a pretty flat area with elevation ranging from 67 to about 80 meters only. Annual rainfall is about 822 millimeters per year. And as I said before, the major land use and land cover are all agriculture related, landscapes. And it falls, of course, in the major physiographic unit of the central Ganga alluvial plain. So that's the major characteristic. So that's the CZO boundary we will consider. And that's a tiny stream which is running through the center of the CZO. We have two observatories here. One is sitting here somewhere. We call this an upstream station. And then we have one which is one is here and one is here. So we'll show you the detailed map of these locations anyway. So, the whole idea of setting up this CZO was that we wanted to look at the parameters, which are set up the baseline parameters, and also look at how the various hydrometeorological parameters are getting modified or not modified by these agricultural activities and so on. So this is our network. We have kind of two AWS, which is sitting here. One is sitting here and one is sitting here, and which are, of course, measuring standard meteorological parameters and so on. And then we have, a number of soil moisture measurements, which you can see here. All these blue dots are, the green dots are sitting up here. I think the box has shifted a little bit. And all the green dots are basically your soil moisture locations, and all the blue dots are our groundwater measurement locations. We have also been looking at, a lot of remote sensing based measurements, satellite based using Sentinel and SMAP data. We've also been mapping the whole area using drone based multispectral camera, thermal IR imaging, and also starting to use the hyperspectral imaging as well in all of these, data sets. And of course, we are measuring this data for the last 2016, 16 and 17 when we started this entire network. That gives you an overall, locational details which we captured from the UAV imagery. So that's our upstream station, and that's our downstream station here. And as you can see, it's entirely agricultural land. There are very few habitation. These are small villages sitting up here, but apart from that, there is not much in terms of the in terms of the human habitation, large habitations and so on. You have a small, tiny river which is coming through here, and that's a small tributary as well. There are dense network, but many of them are dry during the summer. So downstream station also has obviously dominated by the agricultural land. There are some barren lands also you can see, but they are also used for crops in different seasons and so on. And that's the kind of boundary of the major township, which is coming up here. But our CZOs are still quite far, several kilometers from the habitation. So that's the setting. These are our network, the sensor network which we have installed here. That's one of the stations where you can see standard meteorological sensors. Plus, we also have a radiometer installed at these locations. So that's Hydronics radiometer, and and of course other meteorological setup. So apart from this, we have also been doing soil moisture measurements. As I said, a lot of stations which I showed you just now are primarily based on the surface, but there are some locations where we are doing the depth-based measurements as well, and I'll show you some of that data. This is a part of the project which was funded by the AVH, and so we are measuring. These are ground-based measurements, which we are doing both on the surface as well as in the profile. These are some in-situ measurements of discharge, rainfall, temperature, and field surveys. We also talk to the community, get their feedback and interaction in terms of the water availability, the soil utilization, and things like that. Okay, that's a very general, picture of the soil type. It's most of the soil type in this whole CZO is basically falling into loamy to sandy loam kind of a category. These are very, very productive soils. Agriculture is literally booming in that area, which obviously affects the water availability and water utilization patterns as well. Now, if you integrate all of these data sets, this is how it looks like. So that's, again, a Google image. On the top of that, we have put in the UAV image. By the way, I forgot to mention there's a canal which is going in from here, and that's literally forms the edge of the CZO, and that's the small tributary here, and then that's the Pandu River here. So that's sort of a geographical location of this CZO. That's the DEM, which was generated from the drone data set. And you can see again that there are higher elevations on these sides, and also some higher elevations up here. And most of these areas are slightly lower in terms of elevation. But again, the total variability is not very high. It's about 10 to 15 meters only. That's our major land use and land cover, which is plotted up here. Again, most of them is cropland, scattered built up areas, and some ponds, water bodies, and so on. And then we have also collected a lot of data in terms of the agricultural water use. So these are showing up which areas are basically being irrigated by the tube well, which are basically used by the irrigation canal. So obviously that's the canal here. So these are your canal irrigated areas. In the central part, we don't have any canal networks. Most of these are basically using the groundwater stuff as well. That's your soil texture map, as I said, and that's your groundwater data. So, and then, you can also see that we have been collecting some vertical logs of the lithologs. And again, there's a dominance of the loamy soil, which you can see, from these logs as well. Now, we did a very quick exercise of integrating all of these data sets. All of these parameters were integrated together using a very first order, weightage schemes. And the idea was to characterize the entire CZO into different kinds of zones in terms of water availability or water stress and so on. So that's a very first order categorization which we did, which validates pretty much from the ground observation and the data available from there. But we need to do a little bit more on that. We now have a lot more data in terms of soil type and in terms of water data sets have also been extended. So we will probably improve this map a little bit further and try to validate with the independent data sets. So Okay, so that's the kind of a sort of introduction to the CZO in terms of what we have and what is the general data set and an observation which we are making. So let's get into some specific analysis which we have been trying to do. One of them is obviously to look at how the relationship between soil moisture, groundwater, and rainfall, they work out. Using the long-term data sets. Long-term means whatever, since about 2017, we have been collecting the data. So this shows the data set, from about August of 2017, when this CZO became fully operational, all the way down to January of 2020. This needs to be extended now. We are missing, some years of data now and so on. But just to show you the trend here, this is the soil moisture data, and that's the groundwater table data as well. So both of them obviously show a lot of variability. These are obviously related to seasonal, variability. And again, a lot of control coming from the rainfall, data as well. So wherever this is a monsoonal tropical, setting. So whenever rainfall happens, obviously it affects the soil moisture quite significantly. So that's a trend which is quite obvious here as well. And again, this is the groundwater table depth. So whenever again there's a rainfall happening, so the groundwater table is getting shallower and shallower. So that's quite a strong control of the rainfall, which you can see on both soil moisture as well as the groundwater, which is expected in an area like that. And these are our two stations, from there, we are collecting the data set. We also looked at the temporal variability of the spatial mean, and saw both for soil moisture and the depth of the groundwater table. So the same data is now plotted in terms of the temporal variability with respect to the spatial mean. And again, the relationship obviously remains the same. We have now a range of values which for the soil moisture will varies from about 10% to about 43%, and then they show a very strong dependence on the rainfall patterns, which is quite obvious here. There are isolated points like these here, for example, which are which defy the general trend of the groundwater table. This is depth to the groundwater table, which obviously follow the seasonal trend. But there are isolated points like these, which basically is coming because of a sudden shower in terms of rainfall, or sometimes we will show you later. It is also related to a sudden flooding of the water, which affect the soil moisture more and less, obviously, the groundwater table. But these are obviously very quick, rainfall events which we recorded in that area. This is an analysis which is, we have done quite a bit of, statistical analysis on this data set. This is the part of the PhD work of Saroj Das. And so what he has been looking at is to look at the, to kind of look at how the different, empirical orthogonal functions are behaving in this whole area. And you can see the larger circles here, of course, the blue ones are, your soil moisture, and these ones are, the red ones are your groundwater table depth. And obviously all the bigger circles which you see here are higher values in terms of the EOFs, and the smaller values, smaller circles are smaller values here. And these, you can see that in many terrains, they show a sort of an inverse relationship, obviously. So there are, smaller, higher soil moisture values are related to the deeper groundwater table, and the lower soil moisture table, the other way around, higher soil moistures are related to shallower groundwater table, and the vice versa, and so on. So that's the relationship. We also note that the soil moistures are, the groundwater tables are quite deep here, and these are also the elevated areas, if you remember. And otherwise, close to the river and close to water bodies, the groundwater tables they tend to be shallower. So therefore, we also looked at the total variance of both soil moisture and groundwater table data, using about first 20 pairs of each of the AF. So what we found was that the first two EFs of the total groundwater variability, they explain about 91% of the total variability, whereas only about 67% of the variability is explained by the first 5 EFs. So obviously, there's a lot of extreme variability in the groundwater table, but soil moisture is obviously, and also look at the total variance. The total variance of soil moisture is much lower, than the groundwater table, because of the, because groundwater table is a sort of long-term phenomena, whereas soil moisture is affected by these, shorter events, including obviously irrigation practices and so on. So that's a kind of a trend which we can also see as well. We also looked at the controls on the both soil moisture and groundwater table, and we looked at parameters like elevation, percent clay, percent silt, sand, the topographic wetness index, and also slope. And the primary control which comes out, on soil moisture is obviously the very strong control of the soil type, which is obviously clay percentage that controls it very strongly, and of course the second order control is coming from elevation, slope, and silt and clay. Groundwater table is again controlled, by both elevation as well as the soil type as well. So that's the kind of a trend which you see, and the trends of the UF1 and UF2 are sometimes quite different as well. But in general, the clay content and the topography, they come out to be the major controls in both the cases, soil moisture as well as the groundwater table. Then the Saroj did a very interesting analysis of the temporal stability analysis, and he looked at the whole idea of doing this was to look at in a CZO system like this, which is covering about 19 to 20 square kilometer, what is the minimum number of data points which might be representative to reflect the variability in soil moisture and the groundwater table. So he computed the index of temporal stability, the ITS, and he found that there are 4 locations, a minimum of 4 locations which have the minimum ITS values in terms of the soil moisture that will be enough to represent the soil moisture variability in the whole area, whereas one value of groundwater table, groundwater location is good enough to represent the regional variability in the whole area. So that's based on the index of stability of area as well. He also looked at the relationship between the spatial mean values and the measured values and so on, and he found again that very similar relationship here as well, because the RMSE value and R square values are quite good. If you are using 4 locations for soil moisture data and just 1 location for the groundwater table as well. So therefore, it gives us the sense of the variability which is happening or which is occurring in a CZO like that, and how many points are actually good enough to capture the temporal variability. Of course, we are monitoring all the points anyway, but this is an interesting observation which came out from this analysis that, and obviously the location of these is quite important. For example, these 4 locations which you see in terms of soil moisture are very well distributed, and that is why these 4 locations are good enough to measure or to reflect the temporal variability in that area. This one of these wells, which is located to a water body, again was found to be the most temporally stable location, and that is why this is representative of the entire area again, for example. So based on this, we have been trying to suggest or look at what are the implications of such kind of data set in terms of the agriculture water management in a zero setting like that. So that left-hand diagram shows the general setting of the whole area. That's the river that you're looking at. These are some small tributary system. That's a canal on one side. There are some areas which are very high in terms of moisture. Most of them are agricultural lands. These are some other land use and land cover in that area. These are groundwater wells and so on. So what we found that in settings like these, if you want to do an efficient or develop an efficient water management strategies, one of them is of course coming from the control which we saw on coming from the soil texture and topographic variability. So that therefore the water extraction has to be decided and based on that. Second thing is that the water retention structures, particularly in the abandoned topographic depression, they might be useful because that's where these are the areas where the soil moisture is also low, and as with the groundwater table is actually quite deep as well. The canal network, one of the important findings when we talked to the locals was that the canal is there. There's a good water availability in these areas, and many of the canal networks are kind of ending, somewhere here and somewhere here. They don't actually reach all the way, to here. So therefore, there is a general, non-availability of water in these areas in downstream part of the CZO, and therefore even if the canals are existing, many of these are silted and therefore they're not flowing anymore, etc., and so on. So therefore, the expansion and the restoration of the canal network is quite critical in areas like that as well. And again, we also found that some moderate water-intensive crops, if they can be adopted by the farmers, that might also improve the the groundwater and in general the water availability in that kind of an area. People are obviously using Rabi and Kharif, two major crops in this area, and sometimes in the intermediate period they also use a third or sometimes even fourth crop in terms of vegetables and some other short-term crops as well. So there is a huge, it's a very intensive cropping area here, and that obviously leads to a huge abstraction of the groundwater table, groundwater in that area. So and again, that's what is reflected here. You can see here, that's the pre-monsoon part, and that's the post-monsoon, part as well. And you can see that the water table is, reasonably high in the pre-monsoon and post-monsoon. I mean, there's a lot of difference in the pre-monsoon and the post-monsoon type as well. Okay, so that is one set of data set which we have from the ground observations. The other, set of data set which we're trying to use is the satellite-based, data set, for estimating the soil moisture and again validating that with the ground data sets as well. So, Saroj has been exploiting the data from WasteMap and also the AMSR, radiometers. So, and then of course that's the data set which basically shows that how the calibration was done with respect to the SM100 ground soil moisture meter and the C0 mean values and so on. So they are reasonably correlated. And this is a SMAP grid which he has used, and also the LPR AMSR2 data which he also has also used here. Now, this is a busy slide, but what he did was he was looking at the comparison of the different data sets from SMAP and AMSR2, different sensors, and trying to evaluate what is the best performance coming from, and where is the best performance coming from. And and he used bias, RMSE, the unbiased RMSE and R values and so on to characterize all of these data sets. And our observation is that the SMAP L3, in the wet period, that is showing the best and the highest correlation with the zero bias almost. And MSR2X is basically shows a lot of seasonal variability, which has the largest bias, and also RMSE, unbiased RMSE and lowest R as well. So obviously, we found that the SMAP L3 data is performing the best as far as this area is concerned. There are multiple ways also. He also did the triple correlation, analysis, and again he found that the SMR, the SMAP L3 data is one of the best data sets here as well. This data also shows the correlation between the observed, observed data and the SMAP data set, and again you see that the R value is the best, in this case as well. So from multiple, statistical analysis, we found that the SMAP, L3 data is performing the best as far as this area is concerned. Then he also was kind of, looking at the validation of the SML, retrieval algorithm, and trying to relate that with the other, climatic variables and also the vegetation related indices, for example. So that's the plot of the vegetation optical depth, the VOD data set from different, different sensors. And again, this is the SMAP data, the blue one, SMAP. And all of these parameters, the air temperature, rainfall, and potential evaporation, they were all analyzed for the winter, pre-monsoon, monsoon, and post-monsoon periods. And again, the major finding which comes out from here is that we found a very strong and significant negative correlation of MSR2 with air temperature and the evapotranspiration as well. And there are moderate correlation with the rainfall. So that was one observation which we found. And again, when we try to relate that with the NDVI and EVI data set, again, SMAP L3, shows the best correlation with the, with all the vegetation indices as well. And again, in this case, again, when we look at the, the comparison of the different, data sets, again, we found that the SMAP SCA is providing the best values in terms of correlation as well. So these are, the interesting, observation which we found from this data sets here. Okay, now the other, after doing this kind of a regional scale assessment of the of the soil moisture from the satellite-based data sets. We also were trying to explore if we can go zoom into these areas and try and see if we can extract some high-resolution soil moisture data set from using the drone-based thermal infrared camera. So what we did that, this is the kind of a location sites from where we collected a lot of ground-based thermal data, and also we were using a Matrix 600 UAV on which we deployed two cameras together. One was a multispectral camera, Sequoia, and other was a FLIR thermal camera. And we flew the drone together to collect both the multispectral and the thermal data together. So we took several flights between 2018 and 2019, and we collected a lot of the thermal imageries. And of course, at the same time, we also had the ground observation data coming from the thermal infrared temperatures and so on. Very quickly, the algorithm, the optical image data processing obviously involved the generation of orthomosaic and annual land cover, and the thermal data processing was basically involving the calculation of the DN values converted to the BT values, and then eventually to radians, and eventually converting that to the LST. And of course, we also applied atmospheric corrections using the radiative transfer model, and eventually, computer used the reference LST to convert that, correct that LST as well. So what you can see, this is a sample thermal image which we got from the FLIR camera, and you can see that even at a plot scale, you can see the variability in the thermal data sets here, right? So and then of course we are trying to now compute the crop water stress index (CWSI) using this kind of a thermal data set. So some more details are here, and you can see that the post processing of the thermal data obviously involves a lot of steps. Oops. Yeah. So the post-processing, obviously involves quite a lot of steps, calculating the MACD values and eventually raw brightness values converted to the final LST values. But what is really striking here is that you can, at this kind of a scale, you can actually see the plot scale variability in the LST, and that is very important because that then relates to the condition of the land in terms of barren or cultivated, or water bodies in and around, and so on. So you can actually, once you have this kind of a data set, for different seasons, you are ultimately getting into computing the crop water stress at literally at the plot scale, and then advising the individual farmers, at least in different pockets and different regions, how to ultimately utilize the water, in such kind of areas and so on. That's another example of how we are evaluating the LST, and comparing that with the in-situ radiometer data as well. So that's your land surface temperature. This is your brightness temperature, and that's your LST-BT difference. So, and again, you can note the plot scale variability here. That graph primarily shows the difference of the the LST, and that's your the LST value and also the brightness temperature values. And the FLIR FLIR data, the field measurement basically comes somewhere here. So that's the so that shows that it's very well correlated as well, because our radiometer is focusing in a certain areas only, and therefore we captured the FLIR data from that pocket, and we could see that is correlating quite nicely with the radiometer data as well. So we are quite confident of the calculation of the LST, which is coming from the thermal imageries. We also tried to compare the drone-based aerial measurements of the LST, the laser IR temperature, which obviously correlate quite nicely. But we did see some relationship between the ground-based measurements and these measurements, but there are places where it doesn't obviously correlate, because these are probably the point where some quick flooding happened because of the watering by the farmer, or some other external factors might have applied there. But in general, we do find a reasonably good correlation between the aerial data sets and the in-situ data sets here. That's a plot which you can see here, that we try to compare the LST and the brightness temperature, particularly focusing on the land system and the water system. So what you see down below is the profile which is drawn along this river. So along the river, when we look at the profile, we see that the LST is found to be higher than the VT, about 1.5 to about 2K difference along the water body, whereas on land we find this difference to be about 5 to 6K maximum in the land surface. So that's the difference which we know, which we learn from this kind of a data set. So therefore, we know what is the error bars which we are trying to play with, and how we actually correct that as well. Okay, now I am switching to the very quickly. I am conscious of the time as well. So we are now switching very quickly to the the highest resolution scale of soil moisture data set we are collecting, and that is a project which has been supported by the Alexander von Wilder Foundation. And in this project, what we are trying to do is trying to set up a close array of the soil moisture sensors on the ground, and and then relating this data with the other hydrometeorological data. So these both we have created two arrays, one for each of the AWS station which we have, and then we're trying to compare how this ground-based data set eventually corresponds with the hydrometeorological parameters and so on. So that's the kind of a setup. These are the soil sensors which are collected to a hub, and then that is collected to the data logger. The data logger sends the data straight to our computers in our lab. So it's all it's all a very well managed network which we have now. And this is the time scale or time series variability of all of these parameters that you see here. And both these, all these parameters are plotted together: the soil temperature, the rainfall, which is here, the soil moisture, the green ones which you see here, and the air temperature, which is the dotted line which you see here as well. So obviously, we are looking at how these different parameters are varying in different seasons. So this data set starts from the February of 2018 and then goes to about March of March 23rd March of 2021. So that's a long data sets, and it's covering various seasons of pre-monsoon, monsoon, as well as the post-monsoon data sets. And what we're looking at is that how these temporal variabilities are they connected, how how they connect, how this data can be eventually used for the field water management, etc., and so on. So what we'll do, we are trying to look at individual windows of this data set to examine, and we have collected windows from different different seasons and trying to analyze the data sets in terms of the relationship, in terms of the time lag analysis, and then trying to understand. This is still an ongoing project, but I'm just showing some initial result which we have. The other important thing to remember is that it's that there is a huge seasonality in terms of the vegetation cover in this area. So and this is for example, the NDVI of the upstream station in April, and that's the the same station in September, and again the downstream. This is in April, this is in June, and this is in September, and this is in December. So you can see how the NDVI values are changing, through different seasons. This is just for one station. We have similar data for the other station as well. So you can see a lot of these barren areas here in September, but in April, quite a lot of these areas are green. This is June, a lot of crop areas are there. And of course, December, there's again a very large vegetation cover as well. So there is a huge variability in the vegetation cover, and this therefore controls the soil moisture variability as well as the ground table variability in a big way. So we are trying to look at how these parameters behave in terms of the time lag analysis. This is still sort of incomplete. But we are still trying to explore and understand what are the time lag which we are looking at between, for example, soil moisture and soil temperature at a diurnal scale. So this data set is only for a few days. So this is from 11th of April to something like 17th of April. But this data set is coming at hourly interval. So we are actually trying to see how at a diurnal scale, what is the sort of lag between the soil temperature and the soil moisture, what is the lag between soil temperature and air temperature, and then try to understand how this lag can be actually utilized better in terms of designing a better irrigation practice. So that is the analysis which we're intending to do. Not yet complete, but we do see a reasonable relationship. The lags are quite different, for example, for barren areas, for sparse vegetation areas, and also for the high vegetation areas as well. So these lags can vary from anywhere from, this is the, so these are the lags which we're plotting here. And these values can be anywhere from something like 28 hours here and about 31 hours here. And that's again about 20 hours here. And these lags can also be quite different in different seasons. So this is one plot for April, and there's a second plot for June as well. So these are quite different patterns, which we're still trying to understand how we can explain these patterns and how these lags can be ultimately utilized for designing a crop water management, an efficient crop water management practices, for example. Okay, so that's where we are at the moment, and the next steps which we have in mind is to try and move from the course. We have already started some effort on that in terms of moving from the coarse spatial resolution to a finer resolution, which I showed you. We started with the SNAP data, and then we are now looking at the thermal data. That's a regional scale estimation, and that's literally a plot scale estimation as well. So that's something which we are about to close now, and hopefully this analysis will give us a reasonable estimate of the crop water stress, and that should be translated into a proper irrigation scheduling and irrigation water requirement. And once if we have a reasonable model for this area, we hope to upscale it to a larger region as well. Now, so the next steps from this will follow up. We have just initiated a very small project funded by ESA, wherein we are looking at how all of this data set eventually can be used to restore the groundwater system. As I mentioned before, groundwater is the major source of water for a large part of the CZO because the canal network is not very strong in this. And not here, not just here, but many parts of India have the same problem. And most of you know that India, a large part of India, have emerged as the largest hotspot of groundwater use, for example. So that's an interesting idea here to look at how we can try and restore some of the groundwater system by, for example, identifying the sites of recharge, rejuvenating some of the water bodies here, and then trying to keep some balance up here. So that's one project we are trying to do. A new project is about to start, which is going to be funded by by ISRO again. And again, we are trying to expand the thermal data sets in that area, and also trying to bring in some other satellite-based data sets to ultimately develop some sort of integration between different satellite data products, and then eventually decide which products are going to be useful and which one is the best related to the high resolution data which is acquired from the thermal images and so on. So that's one of the objective which we have, and so this site is likely to become a validation site as well for several ISRO missions as well. So that's one of the ideas which we have. The second idea, which I'm sort of just about to submit a large project, is to use a multi-source, data set eventually to focus on the soil nutrient analysis. So again, we are trying to look at the optical data sets from the satellites and also from the drone to characterize this whole CZO into a high resolution landscape, how inhomogeneous the landscape is, and then we come back and use a lot of drone-based images as well as the spectrometer, spectral radiometer to characterize the soil nutrient parameters, particularly, for example, the nitrogen and phosphorus. We also validate that from the soil chemistry, and then see how we can use the hyperspectral imaging, particularly to map the soil nutrient across this whole region. That's one part of it. At the same time, we had a good discussion with Praveen last time, and we are trying to, one of my colleagues is quite interested to set up a real-time field measurement of the methane gases, and he has the expertise of doing that. So we're hoping to set this up as well. And that will again quantify the sources and magnitude of the greenhouse gas fluxes, and hopefully relate that to the paddy cultivation, which is the most prevalent crop systems here as well. The other component of this project would be to raise some short course and to look at the sedimentology, geochemistry, and pollen analysis, and also phytoliths to see if we can set up what was the baseline condition in terms of the sedimentary environment and the vegetation condition. And hopefully, it's a very ambitious project, I know, but hopefully we will be able to integrate all of this data set to ultimately quantify the anthropogenic stress which have been building up on these CZO systems, on soil and the water system. So I'll close now so that we have some time for discussion, and just a few quick points to mention that we have a huge variability, in this, even though the sea level is quite small, but we have seen that there's a huge variability in terms of the particularly the soil moisture and the groundwater, table depth, and they are related to, of course, agricultural practices, the canal network, and the abstraction patterns here. And we have been able to identify some zones in terms of the water stress using the some sort of GIS approach, integrating all of these parameters. Interestingly, in this area, the community support has been very good. In fact, both of our stations are located in the farmers' land, and they actually take very good care of that to safeguard these and to protect these and so on. So that's a very good, and they are also trying to understand what we are trying to do for them and how they can translate that knowledge into their daily routine, or into developing a more efficient irrigation system as well. And then, as I mentioned, we are continuing with the UV-based data sets, remote sensing data sets, to develop the soil moisture estimation, to better the soil moisture estimation from satellite-based data sets all the way down to the UAV. And then, of course, one project we are hoping to start using hyperspectral remote sensing, particularly focusing on the soil nutrient and also using the greenhouse gas emissions measurements at the zero. So I'll stop here for now, but I'll be more than happy to answer a few questions if you have, and also, of course, general discussion, advice, thoughts, anything which you might want to provide us, at this moment. I'm still quite new. Only last couple of years I've ventured into this area, but we are trying to learn new methods and new techniques, trying to use my background of remote sensing, geomorphology, and water, into this. CZO is a truly interdisciplinary science, and I think that integration has been quite useful as far as this site is concerned. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'll be more than happy to answer a few questions.
Thank you, Professor Rajiv. This was very insightful and wonderful talk. Now, floor is open to ask questions if you have any.
So while people are thinking about question, I wanted to just mention that, Rajiv acknowledged a lot of people at the beginning of the talk, but I think by and large, what he presented is the work done by his students at IIT Kanpur, right? I mean, is that a fair understanding? So this is a significant one-person effort to acknowledge. I mean, that's quite impressive to look at the whole range of studies that are being done under a single leadership.
Thank you, Praveen. And both students are right now here, so you can direct some of your questions to them as well.
So one question that comes to mind, Rajiv, is, okay, so Lisa, go ahead. Yeah,
you have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Lisa, go ahead.
I just wanted to, students have an option too. This might be kind of a crazy idea, and it might not work, but I was wondering your observations of the diurnal time lags with soil temperature and moisture. Do you think there might be the potential to do ET separation with the diurnal temperature lags? Or the diurnal lags between temperature and moisture, to see, is moisture leaving through plant transpiration versus soil evaporation?
Yeah, it's a great idea, and we, as I said, we are still exploring the causal factors of the lag, and I think in fact, only a few days ago I was discussing with the student that we need to focus on some controls on where is the control coming from. For example, why the areas which are covered with vegetation and crop are showing a different lag than the ones which are barren. Obviously, the ET will come into picture. The moisture retention by the vegetation will come into picture as well. So we still don't understand the process a lot, but we are trying because we have the data for ET as well. These are all measurements are very close to our AWS, and we are measuring ET as well. So we should be able to integrate that. But that's a very good idea and a very good suggestion. I will certainly try and look into that.
Yeah, because I mean, measuring ET is one thing, but separating it into the evaporation and transpiration components is very, very difficult. Yeah, that's cool.
So one question I have, Rajiv, is that, I mean, you said that these studies are on a relatively small watershed in there. And so what has to happen to guide larger scale up from that watershed to larger areas to basically translate it into some practice?
Yeah, I mean, see, the agriculture practices in most of the Ganga plains are not very different. They are quite similar, and and similarly, the water use pattern is also very similar. As I speak. So therefore, whatever broad finding which we can get from here, we can certainly upscale it at least in terms of the the implementation strategies, for example. So if you look around any other area, I mean, I've been looking at, we have some larger data sets as well for slightly larger areas, for example, at the Kanpur scale, and we don't find much difference in terms of the data set in terms of groundwater variability or in terms of the agricultural patterns and so on. So I think we are trying to build the hypothesis here, and once this is done, looking at the similarity in terms of the irrigation practices and the and cropping patterns, I think the result should be, we should be able to upscale it to a larger region. That's my hope, basically. But we are also talking to the the local state level irrigation departments and trying to seek their advice and suggestions as to how we can ultimately upscale this. What should be the model which they may be happy with, and so on. So there's a discussion going on, but I think we have not reached that stage yet. But my hope is that the results are should be reasonably upscalable.
Thank you. I can keep asking questions. Does anybody else? Yeah, Neil, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, Neil has a question.
Rajiv, anyway, thanks for the talk. This is really interesting and almost, I don't know if I have the right adjective, but it's kind of a real zoom in microscopic look at this set of processes. So I come at this looking at export, like what's going down rivers, what's coming off the landscape, going to rivers. So I'm really intrigued by the lags and the variability and the lags that you're seeing in things like soil moisture. So, we're all talking recently about a paper that just came out of one of our colleagues' groups about the importance of antecedent conditions and export of things like nitrate and water through tile drains and stuff. So I guess I'm a meandering question, but I'm trying, what I want to see is have you thought about linking your studies, your results to trying to get into the noise of the export of what's actually leaving the landscape, since it's very dependent on how much the inventory of water you already have in a soil at a given time when an event comes. So does that make sense? And have you thought about that?
Yes, I didn't show that work, but one of my colleagues has been doing that. He, not exactly the CZO scale, but slightly larger scale. So he looked at the nutrient flux from particularly nitrogen and phosphorus from this small tributary, Pandu River, at that scale. And what was it is, and that paper came out in environmental EST, environmental science and technology. It's a very influential paper. And he showed that even though these rivers are very small, they actually contribute quite huge amounts, in terms of the overall percentage, or in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus. I can send you that paper. I am not a trained geochemist, but he was a part of our team when we were setting up the CZO, and this was a very interesting finding. And he is the one who's ultimately going to set up the greenhouse emission setup as well. So we have tried such studies for small tributary systems like the one which is coming here, and I don't have the numbers right now, but I do remember that he worked out that there is a very sizable fraction or sizable quantities of the these nutrients are actually being transferred from agricultural lands like this into the main Ganga system. So it's something which has, which is being looked at anyway. Yeah.
I just had a quick question on the weather station measurements, where ET is one of the measurements, and I was wondering how you're actually getting that ET from the weather stations. Is that directly in the model?
Yeah, Saroj, you want to answer that? He has been using a set of equations to derive the ET.
Thank you for. Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Thank you for giving the chance. Actually, we did the analysis of ET estimation from the AWS itself using this temperature, air temperature, humidity, and the radiation itself. Actually, we use this Penman-Monteith equation, which is a very established one, and for that, and we use both the AWS are used for this ET estimation throughout the CZO actually. And thing is that if there is some missing data also, we can fill with some other station because the stations are not that much too far, so it maintains somehow continuously data for the ET estimation actually. So we Penman-Monteith, we use this air temperature, humidity, and radiation, and some location parameter also. So things like that, the pressure deficit, everything was estimated from the weather data itself actually.
Thanks.
Yeah. So what we are doing is that for both the stations, the upstream station and the downstream stations, we are estimating the ET, and because the landscape, the agricultural landscape is not very different, we presume that it's Did you see a lot of variability between the two stations, Saroj?
No, not that much, sir, actually.
Very small variability.
Yeah.
So I imagine you're not using the edicovariance instruments because of costs, because
yes.
Yeah.
No, yeah.
Okay, I think we should bring it to a close, sir.
Yeah, if no one has any more question. Thank you everyone for joining this talk. Thanks once again, Professor Rajiv and his team for this talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. It
Thanks,
was nice to
everyone.
meet all of you, and hopefully we'll all meet sometime soon in person now that the pandemic is going, hopefully.
Yes.
So yeah, thanks again for inviting me, and it was really nice to interact with you. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Professor Sinha.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Have a good weekend. Bye.